In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about market indices, kind of give an introduction to the three major types of market indices that are out there. Of those three major types, the first is the price-weighted. The price-weighted approach is used with the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is one of the oldest and most well-known of the indices out there. Was created in 1896, and while right now the Dow Jones Industrial Average has 30 stocks in it, the time it was started there were only 12 stocks. And as you can imagine, in 1896 people weren't walking around with their smartphones and all kinds of other calculators and computers with them at all times. So one of the important things was to have an index that was easy to calculate. And so all they did was they took the price of each of the 12 stocks, add them up, and divide by 12. So a price-weighted index, the name price-weighted comes from the idea that those stocks with a bigger price are going to make up a bigger proportion of the index. The S&P 500 was introduced quite a bit later, and that is one of the major types of what we call value-weighted indices that are out there. Value-weighted is probably the most common approach to creating an index, and value-weighted means that instead of representing each stock based on its price, we represent each stock based on its market value, so that those stocks that have the largest market value are going to have a bigger impact on the overall overall index. One of the things that a lot of people think is, well, since there's 500 stocks in the S&P 500, there's only 30 in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, that the S&P 500 puts a lot more weight on a lot more stocks. And while that is true to some extent, it's probably not as much as a lot of people think, because the way the S&P is set up as a value-weighted index, the top 10 companies in the S&P 500 make up far more of the overall index movement than the bottom 100 companies in the index. It's still, even though there's 500 stocks in there, it's still very heavily weighted towards the top largest companies. And the last type of index, I wouldn't even say this is a popular type, there's not too many indices that use this approach, is an equally weighted index. And probably the most common one that is known for an equally weighted is the value line arithmetic average. An equally weighted, as the name implies, just means every stock has an equal weight in the index. What we do is look at the percentage change, the average percentage change of each individual stock, and then that's how the index moves. So three different approaches to creating an index. Let's go through a little bit of an example to illustrate how that works. So let's say we have a 3-stock index. We're going to have an index with Netflix trading at $220 a share and an 11.7 billion market cap. Ford, $10.50 a share, but almost a 40 billion market cap. And Buffalo Wild Wings trading at $57 a share and about a $1 billion market cap. What proportion does each stock represent depending on the type of index? Well, let's start with a price-weighted index. If we have a price-weighted index, what we're going to do is look at how much each stock represents based on their price. So the first thing I want to do here is just add up the prices. We have $220 for Netflix, $10.50 for Ford, $57 for Buffalo Wild Wings. Gives us a total price of all three stocks added together of $287.50. Now if we look at how much does Netflix make up of that, $220 of the $287.50 is from Netflix. So Netflix is making up 76.5% of that index. Ford is $10.50 of the 287.50. So Ford is only making up about 3.5% of the overall index. Buffalo Wild Wings is 57 of the 287.50. So it's making up about 20% of the index. You can see in this price weighted index, Netflix is really dominating the index, and Ford is not very consequential at all. Ford could double in value. If Netflix drops by 10%, that's going to more than offset the movement in Ford. So a price weighted index is going to be very heavily weighted towards the highest price stocks in the index, and the low price stocks in the index are going to have a very low weighting overall. Now if we want to switch and look at a value weighted index, now we want to look at the weighting based on the market capitalization instead of the price. So if we add up the market capitalizations, 11.7 billion plus 39.9 billion plus 1.08 billion, that's going to give us a total market cap of all three stocks of $52.68 billion. Now when we want to figure out what proportion of that index is being driven by Netflix, Netflix is 11.7 billion market cap of the total 52.68 billion. That means Netflix is representing about 22% of the overall index. Ford has a market cap of 39.9 billion out of the 52.68 total market cap. So that means Ford is accounting for about 76% of the overall index. Buffalo Wild Wings, on the other hand, only has a market cap of 1.08 billion out of the entire $52.68 billion. And so that's only going to be about 2%. Now you can see in this value weighted index where we're looking at market caps, smaller cap companies like Buffalo Wild Wings are going to have very minimal impact on the overall index, whereas larger cap companies like a Ford or in a real world scenario an Exxon or an Apple are going to have a much bigger impact on the overall market. To illustrate that a little bit further, we can do a little bit of a what if analysis. What happens if next quarter the three stock prices change as follows? Netflix drops by 10% from 220 to 200, actually a little under 10%. Ford jumps up almost by 50% and goes from $10.50 up to $15 per share. And Buffalo Wild Wings moves by a small amount from $57 to $55 per share. Let's start with the price weighted. Price weighted index, a very simple way to calculate that. We just add up the three prices, divide by 3. That gives us our initial index value of 95.83. Then the stock prices change. Netflix goes from 220 to 200, so we drop the price there. Ford goes from $10.50 to $15, so we increase the price for Ford. Buffalo Wild Wings drops from 57 to 55. So we drop the price of Buffalo Wild Wings. Again, just add them up, divide by 3. Our index level is now 90. In this scenario, the price weighted index went to 90 from 95.83, so we had a change of negative 5.83 off of our initial value of 95.83. What I was thinking when I set up that template, but that should be the change divided by the original there. So that gives us a percentage change in our index of negative 6.08%. So in this case, our index declined. We had an average drop in our stocks by negative 6% if we're looking at a price weighted index. And again, that's largely driven by that change in Netflix, which is our highest price stock. If we do a value weighted index, things look a little bit different. We start out with the total market values. Remember our original market values that we had? Netflix was 220, 53 million shares outstanding for a market cap of 11.7 billion. Ford was 1050, 3.8 billion shares outstanding for a market cap of $39.9 billion. And Buffalo Wild Wings, $57 a share, 19 million shares outstanding for a total market cap of 1.08 billion. So if we just add those up, that's our total market caps. Gives us a market cap of 52.68 billion. Now we go forward. Shares outstanding didn't change. This is a simple example. You could have a scenario where shares outstanding change, and that makes things a little more complex. But right now we're going to assume the shares outstanding remain the same. So Netflix drops to 200. We take the 200 times the number of shares outstanding, gives us a total market cap of Netflix of 10.6 billion. Same thing with Ford. Ford increases from 1050 to 15. So we take the $15 new price times the number of shares outstanding, 3.8 billion, gives us a total market cap of 57 billion. And with Buffalo Wild Wings, the price dropped from 57 to 55. So we take the new price times the shares outstanding. Buffalo Wild Wings' new market cap is 1.05 billion. So our total market cap went from 52.68 billion to 68.65 billion. So now we calculate the percentage change, the new ending value minus the previous ending value gives us the change in the index. Divide by the previous ending value, index went up by 30.3%. Notice that's a pretty big difference than what the price weighted told us. So even though we're looking at the same stocks, same changes in price, we have a very big difference depending on how we construct our index. A price weighted index, because it's driven by the largest price stock, Netflix was the largest price stock, it went down, showed that our overall stock market went down during that time period. A value weighted index, driven more heavily by the largest cap stock in the market, which was Ford. Ford went up substantially in this scenario, and therefore our market average was up. Same stocks, same price changes. This is telling us the markets declined. This is telling us the markets went up. So you can see price weighted versus value weighted can give a very different answer. Our third approach is the equally weighted. With the equally weighted, every stock, as the name implies, is weighted equally in our index. So what we want to do is say Netflix went from 220 to 200. It had a decline of $20, so our change is negative 20 divided by the original price. Netflix had a drop in value of 9.1%. Ford increased in value to 15 from its original price of $10.50. That meant Ford went up by 42.9%. Buffalo Wild Wings dropped slightly from 57 to 55. Divide by the original price of 57. Buffalo Wild Wings declined by 3.5%. Take an average, because each stock is weighted equally. Negative 9.1 plus 42.9 plus 3.5, and that average, they should all be divided by 3. Once we divide by 3, that gives us our change in our index of 10.1%. Now you can see here very different results again. Our value weighted said that the markets were up the most, 30.3%, because it put the biggest weight on Ford, which had the biggest up move. Our price weighted went the other way, and it said our average stock declined by a little over 6% because our biggest stock, Netflix, went down, and that's where the price weighted put its focus. The equally weighted portfolio was in the middle, and it said the average stock went up by 10.1%, so it was telling us overall stock market went up by 10.1 because it was weighting each stock equally. So we've got 3 different methods, and as you can see, they can all give very different results depending on what stocks move. Which is better? What is a better approach? Well, let me start with what is worse, and that's the price weighted. Why is the price weighted approach the worst? Because price is arbitrary in thinking about the impact on one's portfolio. Think of a scenario where you have Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock in your portfolio. That stock right now, as I'm recording this video, is trading for about $105,000 a share. You put that stock in with any 10 others, and your entire portfolio is going to be driven by Berkshire Hathaway. Now let's say that Berkshire Hathaway decides to have 1,000 for 1 stock split. All of a sudden the stock price, instead of being $105,000 a share, is $105 a share. Now it's not going to be near as heavily weighted on the index. Has anything really changed to make Berkshire Hathaway go from dominating the index to not having much of an impact at all? No. Price weighted is arbitrary because it can be affected by stock splits or things like that don't really affect one's portfolio. Why then is the most popular index among most individuals the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a price weighted index? Again, it goes back to history. Dow Jones Industrial Average is so popular because it's one of the oldest well-known indices, and at the time it was created, we didn't have the computing power to do anything much more complex than add them up and divide by the number of stocks in the portfolio. It was a simple approach, and it worked reasonably well, but theoretically it's not a very good model. The best approach, I would argue, is the value weighted index. Now it's not perfect because the value weighted index still puts a lot of emphasis on a few key stocks. The largest companies out there, the Exxons, the Apples, are going to make up so much more of an impact than companies like a Buffalo Wild Wings. However, if you think about it, those stocks that have the biggest impact in the index are probably going to have a bigger impact in the average person's portfolio. Because they're more valuable, they're going to represent a more valuable portion of most people's portfolio. So value weighted actually measures what the stock market is doing. Those companies that have a higher value should have a higher impact in the overall portfolio. Those stocks that have a low value probably shouldn't have much impact when we're trying to determine what's happening in the markets. In between, there is the equally weighted portfolio. I like that a little bit better than the price weighted approach. Obviously nowhere near as well as the value weighted approach, but that's allowing each stock to have an equal weighting. It makes a little more theoretical sense than price weighted because it's not going to be affected by things like stock splits or something arbitrary of that nature. Another way to think of which is better, good way to judge for that, is look at how most indices are constructed. Most indices are constructed as value weighted indices. The S&P 500 is a value weighted index. The Russell 1000, Russell 2000, Russell 3000 are all value weighted indices. The Wilshire 5000, which is a total market index, that's a value weighted index. So we see a lot more value weighted indices out there just because they provide a better theoretical framework.